Well, welcome back to our course on Revelation. This is session 20, which will cover Revelation chapters 17 to 19. This is the very most difficult part of Revelation to explain, and the one which commentators disagree on quite a bit. And a little side issue came up as I was working on this. So I've decided to create a little side lesson, which we will call 20A, which will discuss one particular topic and hopefully take that out of the longer session that follows. So I'm not sure this actually makes anything shorter, but 2 lessons instead of 1. So the special topic has to do with the identity of the city, the great city Babylon. The majority of scholars consider Babylon to be the city of Rome, ancient Rome, but a minority, have argued that it is Jerusalem. Now, to be honest, I would be tempted just to ignore this minority view, but it occurs in a popular Catholic resource called the Ignatius Study Bible. There's a little side article called Who is Babylon on pages 514 and 515, and it also occurs as the view of Michael Barber in his book Coming Soon, Unlocking the Book of Revelation. So the Ignatius Bible Study argues that while both views are possible, they favor the minority view that the great city or harlot is in fact Jerusalem. Well, in order to examine this issue further, I wanted to look at the information that's presented in the Ignatius Study Bible, and I've made a summary chart. This is not all the information, obviously, on those 2 pages, but I put this in 2 columns, Babylon as Rome and Babylon as Jerusalem. And since the Ignatius Study Bible didn't put it in a chart, the organization of this is probably not the best for comparison, but it is the way they organized it. So the first argument in favor of Rome would be that St. Irenaeus, writing in the 200s, says that John received his vision during the reign of Domitian, or around 96 AD. And if this is the case, then the book is written clearly after the destruction of Jerusalem. So setting the book as a prophecy for the destruction of Jerusalem wouldn't make any sense. And if you look in the course pack under the date, there's a lot more information than this about this dating and why Domitian would be more favorable. Another particular piece of evidence is the fact that the early Christians would use the name Babylon as a code for Rome. They did not want to write something which was negative towards Rome in case the Romans got a hold of it and accused them of sedition. So they used this code word Babylon when they really meant Rome. And one very clear example of this is in 1 Peter 5:13, but also we see the same tradition carried on in some later Jewish apocalyptic texts, 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch. These are not books of the Bible, but later Jewish writings, but very close to the New Testament period. One of the strongest pieces of evidence would be the fact that the harlot city is depicted as seated on 7 hills. And there is some imagery of the goddess Roma seated on 7 hills. It would have been extremely well acknowledged that that is a name for Rome. If someone in the ancient world in the 1st century said the city on the 7 hills, there would have been no doubt. They would have got that question on Jeopardy. The harlot city is also said to be drunk on the blood of Christian martyrs, and this, of course, would make sense for Rome. It also, in a weaker sense, could be applied to Jerusalem. There were martyrs in Jerusalem, such as Stephen, but obviously the greater number and the wider spread application would have been Rome. This one is probably one of the stronger arguments. The city is said to have dominion over many kings and peoples, and unless we're talking about ancient Israel, Jerusalem at the time of Jesus was a underneath Rome and was controlled by them, and certainly was not having dominion over kings and peoples unless there was a historical reference. So this would be difficult to apply to Jerusalem, but very easy and obvious to apply to Rome. Then there are, of course, many Old Testament allusions, and John reaches back to allude to the Old Testament where there is judgment, and the examples that he chooses are all of the judgment of pagan cities. And so as we go into the material, I'll highlight this deeper. But just looking down that list, this is a pretty weighty argument in favor of Babylon, meaning Rome, and probably why the vast majority of scholars have favored it. And if you look in the footnotes of my course pack, you'll see just what a minority it is that actually say Jerusalem. Then if we turn over to the Jerusalem side, the strongest piece of evidence, or let's call it the most puzzling piece of evidence, is the earlier description in Revelation 11:8. The great city is described by the symbolic names Sodom and Egypt, and then it says, quote, where indeed their Lord was sacrificed. And it's hard not to see that as Jerusalem. Of course, that is where Jesus was crucified. So how do we, if Rome is true, how do we explain this? Or does this completely tip the balance in favor of Jerusalem? Well, the most common response by scholars to this is that Rome was considered to exist wherever the kingdom of Rome or the reign of Rome extended. So to the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire, it was still considered Rome. And if you think about Jesus' crucifixion, it was not the Jews who crucified him, but it was the Romans. The Jews did not have authority to punish someone for a capital crime, and it was Roman soldiers who executed him. So in a more symbolic sense, because here it talks about this symbolic name, Sodom, Egypt, it may just be that this description is referring to any city which is the type which persecutes the faith. Any city that, whether it's the Pharaoh in Egypt, or whether it's Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, or whether it was the prophets prior to that. So just a symbol for this generic idea of any city that would. So I think we can explain this away. It remains a little bit puzzling. Then another piece of evidence that's cited is we noted that the harlot is drunk on the blood of martyrs, but it also says prophets in 1824. And normally, Jerusalem is the one that is accused of martyring the prophets, not Rome. But again, if we have this more generic understanding of any city that happened to persecute the faith, this would make sense in a symbolic kind of way. And also, I would point out there were Christian prophets at the time of the New Testament. And you'd have to look carefully at that to see whether the reference was to Old Testament prophets or this new emerged group of people called prophets in the New Testament era. We see them talked about in a document right outside the New Testament called the Didache, or the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. There are itinerant prophets traveling from place to place, and they are referenced in the book of Acts. So again, a puzzling thing, but not really an overwhelmingly strong thing. Then the commentary cites this piece of evidence, which I actually think goes against them. It says that the harlot city seduces the nations, but Jerusalem is accused of the Old Testament prophets of prostituting herself to the nations by unfaithfulness. So these aren't really the same thing. The harlot city reaches out and seduces other people. Jerusalem is, if that's what we're talking about, is the Old Testament people of God are seduced by the other nations. So the way the influence is traveling is in a different direction. I don't think that's a very good parallel. Then The way this is worded, it sounds quite strong. A voice from heaven summons the faithful to flee the city in 18:4, to avoid the plagues and fire in 18:8. But if you actually go and read the verse in 18:4, it can be read merely as be holy, come out from the unholy people that you're living among, don't associate yourself with them. It's not necessarily pack your bags and leave town. Now, there is an interesting parallel in Luke 21:21, and if this really did mean flee, then this would be a stronger argument, because in Luke, the early Christians were told that there would be a time when they would have to flee Jerusalem before the destruction of Jerusalem. And some later church historians tell us that this actually did take place. So interesting, but again, not overwhelmingly strong. It's also argued that there's a sense of urgency to the fiery destruction in these verses. Yet, if we read the New Testament, it says Jesus is coming soon, and soon has lasted 2,000 years. So just how seriously do we take the sense of urgency? I don't know. It depends what we think this means. If there are two horizons here, a historical horizon in the time of the early Christians, and then a final horizon to understanding this in the end times, maybe, but you'd have to read these yourself and say, what sense of urgency are we reading? Plus, the type of descriptions of the destruction are cataclysmic, like the world is ending, falling apart, coming apart at the seams. Well, that doesn't really match the destruction of Jerusalem. It doesn't match the destruction of Rome either, but in this symbolic sense, it might. Okay, so again, I don't think it's a really strong argument. Finally, they say there would be a better parallel between the destruction of the harlot city in 17 and 18 with the coming of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21 and 22. Certainly this is true, and it would be a great sermon illustration, but the fact that this parallel might be cool doesn't make it true or right. So we would need some compelling reasons to think that this parallel exists. And if it doesn't, it would make much more sense to see this as a kind of symbolic condemnation of any city, any empire, any beast that would oppose the faith and persecute the faithful, and that Rome at the time was the personification of this, and so most of the imagery is pointing towards Rome. But the symbolism isn't intended to kind of end there. It can include any nation or empire that would oppose. So I would urge you to go and look at the course pack. I have written up an extensive response in pages 37 to 41. In my opinion, the Jerusalem view is possible, but I think the possibility is very weak. But the Rome view is pretty clear, and I think that we can explain any anomalies. And if we have to explain one way or explain the other way, it's much easier to explain the things that don't conform with Rome than it is to explain the things that don't conform with Jerusalem. So one final note, I do not want anyone to go away thinking that I don't like the Ignatius Study Bible. I think it is a great resource, and all that I'm doing is disagreeing with one little point of interpretation in their text. And if you ever begin to read various commentaries, you'll realize that there are many points of disagreement between interpreters. Reading a commentary is very different from reading the Catechism. When we go to the Catechism, St. John Paul II, then Pope John Paul II told us that the Catechism was a sure norm for our faith. So if we read something in the Catechism and it tells us this is what we believe, then that's not up for argument or dispute. And if someone stands up and says something contrary, then what they're saying is a speculation and it's not what we believe. When we come to commentaries, it is very different. There was an adage that was put out there that where there are 3 rabbis, there are 4 opinions, and that could well be applied to commentators. So even among Catholic commentators who are very pious and faithful to the church, they're going to have different opinions about the meaning of certain passages. So their opinions can't lead them to think things that are contrary to the faith, but so much of our understanding of the Bible is open to varying interpretation. So I hope I'm being clear. The Ignatius Study Bible is great. I highly respect the authors behind it. I'm not meaning to in any way reflect negatively on them. I just happen to disagree with this particular point of interpretation. On that note, I wanted to suggest another possible commentary that you could look at if you're interested. This is a commentary series called The Catholic Commentary on Sacred Scripture, and the volume on Revelation is written by Peter Williamson, who is a professor at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. I think this commentary is quite detailed, very Catholic, and accessible to the average layperson. The only thing about this commentary series is if you purchase the Ignatius Study Bible, it's just one book that you're buying. If you were to begin purchasing the volumes of this, each individual book of the Bible has its own volume, and this is still a work in progress. But I found this volume on Revelation very, very helpful. And so if you're looking for another resource, I would recommend